Okay, I'm going to share my screen. We're going to go through a few slides, not many, that kind of summarize the dyslexia laws that are specific to Iowa and kind of the progression of what that legislation's been the last few years. Before we talk about that, I did want to talk a little bit about this group called Decoding Dyslexia. So Decoding Dyslexia is an advocacy group that was started by parents in the state of New Jersey in 2011. And over the last 9 years, it has spread to all 50 states. And they're a very active group of parent advocates, and it's begun to encompass many professionals as well. So their purpose is really to advocate for changes in districts and for changes at the state and federal level around dyslexia. So they have a very kind of consistent and comprehensive set of objectives that they're lobbying for across the country. So those things are things like establishing a universal definition of dyslexia, creating laws that mandate teacher training and changes to training programs, early screening. Many states have adopted new screening for early detection of dyslexia, access to assistive technology for kids, and kind of mandatory approaches to instruction that would ensure that kids in special education or general education get instruction that matches and is consistent with the evidence base for what works for kids with dyslexia. So that's kind of their general lobbying, and all the states have kind of modeled their approach, all the groups across the country, after kind of that original effort that started on the East Coast. They're very active on Facebook. So if you're at all interested in seeing kind of what is happening with Decoding Dyslexia in Iowa, I would encourage you to follow the Facebook group. That's the easiest way to keep up with what's going on in the state. So the way that this happened in Iowa was the first law that was passed was in 2014. And that was the one that officially did define dyslexia. There had been no definition at all before, but that was actually the older definition that we talked about earlier. And then directed the Department of Ed and the Iowa Reading Research Center to provide training. So that provide training was never really funded at any big level. So the training that ended up being developed was the online module that you were to take before you began this course. So that's what came out of that law. In April of 2016, another law was passed that really focused more on teacher training. So that was trying to guide the teacher prep programs in Iowa and to do more instruction, systematic and explicit literacy instruction and dyslexia, and change some administrative rules so that they included dyslexia specific language. In April 2018, a dyslexia task force was developed that kind of included, a whole bunch of stakeholders from all different groups across the state: AEA, districts, state, Iowa Reading Research Center, some clinical professionals, some teachers, some people that work at tutoring clinics and things like that. And they were to develop a report and then give that report to the governor and the state legislature, to the General Assembly, no later than November 15th, 2019, which was this last November. They did that. And as a result of the report that they shared with the state legislature last November, the most recent law was passed June 2020. And the most recent law comes straight out of the recommendations of that task force. And it's by far the most far-reaching of any of the laws that have happened, that have been passed. And it was passed actually unanimously by both the House and the Senate in the state. So what that did is created a standing dyslexia board in Iowa. So there will be a board. They adjusted the membership a little bit to include some more district and school people. But we'll have parents, people from Decoding Dyslexia, clinical professionals, and those kind of people that will continue to push and monitor all this legislation. It required the Board of Educational Examiners, in cooperation with Iowa Reading Research Center, to create a new dyslexia teaching endorsement That's a couple years out, so I think that we may hear more about in the next few years. It requires all Iowa educators to complete the IRRC's online dyslexia overview module. There's some steps about how long districts have to make sure everybody does that. And then requires the Department of Ed and the AEAs to employ dyslexia specialists. It's unclear if that will be funded, so that will be interesting to see how that develops. And then actually changes the definition in Iowa to match the IDA definition of dyslexia. So one thing we'd like you guys to do next is actually read. There's two choices. You could read the summary of the report. If you are an administrator or someone that's very interested in this, or maybe an interventionist or special education teacher, you may want to read the full report. It has a lot more detail in it. But we want you to actually read that report or the summary of the report so that you can really know what's in there and how that might impact your role.